So thank you for joining us today. My name is Ted Ruger. I'm a professor of law here, teaching constitutional law and health law and other subjects. And want to thank the Federalist Society for organizing this auspicious event where we'll hear from two of the country's leading experts on religion in the United States. So I'm here. I actually volunteered to do this introduction when I saw this on the schedule, and so I'll start with a personal introduction of our speaker, Professor Francis Beckwith, and then give you just a tiny taste of his ample professional accomplishments. I first met Frank during my first ever class. I taught as a law professor in 2001 at Washington University in St. Louis, where I started my career. Needless to say, and even at that, by the time he came to the class, Frank's talents and knowledge about the law and the history of religion vastly exceeded mine. So it was quite a daunting thing as a young professor. It also, I guess, disproved one maxim and proved to a great extent another. So one maxim you hear sometimes is you all hear about, liberal law professors indoctrinating their students and maybe even brainwashing their students. Well, neither in the class or certainly today. I think Frank Frank sits here and as you'll hear during his talk, there was not much indoctrination going on, and it was a relationship of kind of mutual respect, and as it is today, and somebody I love to talk about these issues with. The second maxim, which I kind of was more true than I know, is sometimes professors, we say to you at the end of class, the end of the semester, well, I've learned more from you than you've learned from me. Now, sometimes that might be kind of true. Maybe you don't want it to be true. But if it's true at all, we're using you in the plural sense, right? It's pretty rare when I learn more from one student in the singular during the course of a semester than he learned from me. And I think that was probably the case with Professor Beckwith. Since he left Washington University, and despite suffering through my first year of teaching, Frank has continued his path as a leading expert on church and state in American life. He's currently a professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor University, appointed both in the Department of Philosophy as well as teaching courses in the Political Science and Religion Department. He's also served as an associate director of the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies and published widely numerous books and many dozen articles about the place of religion and religious ethics in American life. If I've learned a lot from Frank, I've learned even more over the past decade from my friend and colleague, Professor Sarah Gordon, who will comment on Frank Beckwith's lecture. Sally is a major expert in the history of religion in American life. She's the Arlin Adams Professor of Constitutional Law here at Penn Law School, as well as a professor in the History Department. Ph.D. from Princeton, J.D. and degrees from Yale, J.D. from Yale as well as degrees in the Divinity School, and is the leading writer in the kind of historical place of religion in American life in multiple contexts, both specific contexts such as the Mormon Church and much more broad and general context as she's laid out in a wonderful recent book from a few years ago that I commend to you called The Spirit of the Law, Religious Voices and the Constitutions in American History. So it's my pleasure to introduce both of these distinguished speakers, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments, Ted. I don't know if you remember this, but Ted's a little younger than me. And so I was a 39-year-old law student, and I think you were 32 at the time. And so we would talk after class once in a while, and he said, "Call me Ted. Look, you're a professor." And I said, "Yeah, but not in front of the kids." Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's a delight to have someone like Professor Gordon, who is an accomplished scholar in the area of history, religion, and law, to comment on what I'm going to say this afternoon. There's all of you should have. I don't know if everyone has a copy of the notes. Does anyone not have a copy. Very good. The title of this lecture is Faith, Reason, and Law. And I open up with a quote from Jeremy Waldron. Jeremy Waldron, I believe, is still at NYU Law School. He's a scholar does a lot of work on philosophy of law, jurisprudence. This is from a book that he published several years ago on John Locke, the great English philosopher who had a profound influence upon the American founding. This is from the book. He began, and it's on the top of your study sheet. Secular theorists often assume that they know what a religious argument is like. They present it as a crude prescription from God, backed up with threat of hellfire derived from general or particular revelation. And they contrast it with the most elegant complexity of a philosophical argument by Rawls or Dworkin. With this image in mind, they think it obvious that religious argument should be excluded from public life. But those who have bothered to make themselves familiar with existing religious-based arguments in modern political theory know that this is mostly a travesty, unquote. What I'm going to talk about is the relationship between faith and reason and how it gets reflected in some cases that have been before the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as some authors that have been publishing on this topic over the past decade or so in the law reviews. I'll give you an idea of where I'm going with this. I've just completed a book manuscript called Taking Rights Seriously, R-I-T-E-S. And it's about the way in which I think religious beliefs are treated in the legal literature and as well as in the courts in ways that I don't think truly reflect the complexity and nuance and level of arguments that one actually finds offered by serious religious believers. Several years, it was 9 years ago, I gave a talk at Texas Tech University. It was soon after, actually about 2 years after I had graduated from WashU Law School, and I had been hired at Baylor in the Church-State Studies Institute, and I was there to talk about a book I had published called Law, Darwinism, and Public Education. The lecture focused on some of the constitutional questions about evolution and intelligent design and so forth. And my own views on this, I actually think that intelligent design is a flawed view for a variety of reasons. But the lecture dealt with the constitutional question. So I talked about the sorts of arguments that people make for and against teaching it, or why it should be permitted or banned, etc. At the very end of the lecture, there was a question and answer period, and there was a gentleman in the audience from one of the science departments, and he raised his hand, and he didn't ask a question. He just said, "Professor Beckwith, all you've given us this afternoon are religious arguments." I said, "I'm relieved. I thought you were going to say they were bad arguments." Now, the laughter was much better when it really happened. The point of that response was this, that there is this tendency that if you put the word adjective religion in front of any sort of belief that a person holds, therefore, there's really no need anymore to carefully investigate the reasons that people give why they hold those beliefs. It's a kind of metaphysical exclusionary rule for those who have taken criminal law. That is, it's a way in which some thinkers exclude from consideration points of view that religious citizens may hold on a variety of different topics and issues. One other point. I want to distinguish what I'm critiquing from a school of thought that is often, people often think of it as being critical of religion, but I don't think it actually is. There's a view that's often affiliated and associated with the philosopher John Rawls. Some of you may be familiar with Rawls. He died 11 years ago. He taught for several decades at Harvard University and a profound influence on the way in which people have thought about the relationship between religion, law, and politics. He has a view that he calls political liberalism. Now, it's not what we ordinarily think of as political liberalism in our common political discourse. It's a term of art referring to a particular way in which the public square should be viewed in terms of the way in which religious citizens offer arguments. And so one of the points that Rawls makes is that we all come to the public square with what are called comprehensive doctrines. That is, we all have worldviews or ways of looking at the world that have been shaped significantly by philosophical and religious commitments that we have. And that actually affects the way in which we look at different public policy questions, different questions that are more fundamental, that are outside of politics. So for example, you've probably had this phenomenon happen to you. You'll get in an argument with let's say, a friend or a colleague, a disagreement of some sort, and you think that you have the best knockdown, drag-out argument you can possibly imagine, and this person is unconvinced, but you realize that the person is informed, intelligent, knows as much about the issue as you do, and yet they are unpersuaded by the case you're making. This has a lot to do with the plausibility structures that we enter the public square with. That is, sometimes we hold beliefs that we think are so fundamental that even if somebody offers an argument that we can't answer at the moment, we would rather hold off with the hope that that argument will be answered rather than to simply abandon our beliefs. That is, so for instance, imagine somebody gives you a kind of standard argument for moral relativism, the view that there are no objective moral norms. And you realize that to be a moral relativist would entail that you'd have to say things like certain sorts of gross injustices are not intrinsically wrong. And so what happens is you say, I can't really give you a good answer to relativism, but you know what? I don't think it's worth abandoning because I'm more sure that this is wrong than in fact the case you're making is going to hold up in the future. So what Rawls says is that we all enter the public square with these comprehensive doctrines, these fundamental beliefs, and these comprehensive doctrines can be religious, secular, and philosophical. It really doesn't matter. And the reality is this is the consequence of living in a free society. That is, once you provide to people a structure in which they can exercise their liberties, people are bound to disagree. In fact, when you hear people lament about disagreement, it's often, I see it as a kind of passive-aggressive brief against liberty. Because if you think about it, if you live in a society in which is free, people are bound to disagree, right? Because there are just too many people that know a lot and who are really smart, right? And that happens all the time. And so Rawls wants to give an account of how you can have a just society and at the same time allow for this disagreement. And he says, look, we all have there's a variety of reasonable comprehensive doctrines. What does he mean by that? He means that even though I am reasonable, in other words, I hold a view that doesn't seem to be obviously irrational, it's reasonable to believe, that doesn't mean that you are required to believe it. This again, in our own sort of interaction with people, we see this in political discussions. You can have an argument with somebody, you know that they're perfectly rational, you follow their premises and you understand their conclusion, and yet you're unconvinced. It's not that one of you is irrational and the other is rational, it's just that reasonable people can come to different conclusions even though they may be aware of the same cluster of facts. And so Rawls says that that in such a society, we have these fundamental liberties, and we're not justified in coercing other citizens who may disagree, with whom we think are wrong, or for whom we think are mistaken, based on our comprehensive doctrines. And so Rawls is saying that in a free society such as ours, people widely disagree, and they're reasonable. That point of view is not what I'm critiquing this afternoon. What I want to talk about is another point of view, one that is, I think, a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more combative. And that's the view, in fact, I even think that Rawls's view is in some sense quite a modest point of view. It's an approach that sees all religious worldviews as fundamentally irrational or unreasonable because they depend on beliefs that are not amenable to reason. The implication of this view, that some, though not all proponents of it explicitly acknowledge, is that religiously informed policy proposals have no place in a secular liberal democracy that requires the primacy of reason. So the point of view that I'm going to critique is not the view that Rawls holds, that religious citizens can be just as reasonable in their worldview as secular citizens. There may be limits on what they can do in terms of putting their views into public policy, but the views themselves are not being prohibited because they're irrational, but because they may coerce a fundamental liberty that a fellow citizen has. What I'm critiquing, or going to bring to your attention and raise some questions about, is a view that says that all religious views are by their nature irrational, which is a very strong point of view. Now, I think you can find this view in among two casts of characters. One, the courts, and secondly, among some legal theorists. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the courts, partly because I think that when you hear comments about religion offered by some justices, especially when they're talking about whether religion is rational or not, or if they sort of imply that religious beliefs are by their nature irrational, I think we have to read them charitably. That is, they probably are saying it not because they're scholars of philosophy of religion or philosophical theology or metaphysics or any of these other disciplines. It's just that they've inherited and have assimilated understandings that they received during their formative years. But I should mention them because I do think that one of the things that stands out about some of these opinions is this implication that religious beliefs are fundamentally irrational. Let me cite here some of the justices. In a 1976 opinion, Justice William Brennan, in a case Serbian Orthodox Diocese versus Miklajevic, he writes, quote, "It is the essence of religious faith that ecclesiastical decisions are to be reached and are to be accepted as matters of faith, whether or not rational or measurable by objective criteria." He further goes on to argue that, quote, "Constitutional concepts of due process, including secular notions of fundamental fairness, are therefore hardly relevant to such matters of ecclesiastical cognizance." And in his opinion, he cites the great Clarence Darrow. Some of you know of Darrow. He was the great defense attorney, but also he became internationally renowned for his defense of a gentleman named John Scopes in the famous monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. He says, quote, "The distinction between the religious and the secular is a fundamental one. To quote from Darrow's argument in the Scopes case, the realm of religion is where knowledge leaves off and where faith begins, and it never has needed the arm of the state for support, and wherever it has received it, it has harmed both the public and the religion that it would pretend to serve." And by the way, I made a mistake. That's actually John Paul Stevens from another case. So that wasn't Brennan. But there are other cases. And actually Justice Stevens in another case, it's not a majority opinion, but in a concurring opinion, or actually dissenting opinion in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, he calls the anti-abortion position on fetal personhood a religious tenet that cannot, in principle, rise to the level of knowledge so that it may be reflected in our laws. So you find this throughout. There are also places, numerous other opinions, where the justices will sometimes refer to religion as the religion of one's choice, which assumes that religious belief is something that you choose. It's probably not the case. Most of our beliefs we don't choose. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. For example, I have the belief that I am being appeared to studently right now. That is to say, there are students out there, right? And it's a belief that I hold, but I wouldn't know how to unbelieve it. It seems as in many cases, many of our most fundamental beliefs that we hold are not beliefs that we choose. Not to say that there aren't conversions, that people in fact do change their beliefs, but they're not like commodities. They don't seem to be the sorts of things that we deliberate about in the same way in which we deliberate about other matters. So in general, the common thread of these opinions, and as we clearly couldn't go over a lot of them, just very briefly gave you a few highlights, is that religious beliefs and their attendant notions, what I mean by attendant notions are moral and metaphysical beliefs, are akin to self-regarding private and personal matters of taste and thus not proper subjects of rational assessment. It seems to be what one finds. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are justices that obviously who don't hold that view. But generally, the courts have seemed to make this assumption about the nature of religious beliefs. Now I want to go on and talk a little bit about the legal theorists. One finds in the legal theorist a much more sophisticated defense of this point of view. And I'm going to just briefly go over three in particular. One is Stephen Gay, who taught for years at Florida State. He recently passed away, I understand, and he has written a number of articles on religion and the law. And let me just cite here some quotes from Professor Gay. He says, concerning politics, he says, in a proper democracy, religion should be primarily a private phenomenon because religion and politics are simply incompatible. This is because, he writes, religion is particularly ill-suited to the sorts of pressures and influences that define the political process. Combining the typical political phenomenon of personal greed, self-aggrandizement, duplicity, log-rolling, deal-making, and unprincipled compromise with the typical religious phenomena of theological certainty, absolute moral dictates, and the threat of eternal damnation creates an especially dangerous cocktail, unquote. For Gay, the separation of church and state parallels the separation of faith and reason. And this is something you find often where among some thinkers, state becomes a kind of proxy for rationality, and faith becomes a kind of proxy for religion, or for church, right? So you find this in much of his writings, and another thinker is Susanna Sherry. She suggests, and again, she takes this analogy even further. She says that the relationship between church and state, as embodied in the Constitution's free exercise and establishment clauses, should be viewed as analogous to what she describes as the different and contrary epistemic commitments of faith and reason. Some of you may have heard the word epistemic before. I'm a philosopher by training who went to law school, but epistemology is a discipline within, or an area of study within philosophy that deals with questions of how we know things and how we justify knowing things. And so what she's saying is that those that claim to know based on faith are actually claiming something that is inconsistent with, or in many cases inconsistent with a deliverance of reason. She concedes, quote, that while it may be possible to envision a religion based wholly or partly on reason, most of the major religions in America are based on faith as the underlying epistemology. What she means by faith is something like just believing despite the evidence. It's not a kind of faith that you find for those who may have studied thinkers as different as Thomas Aquinas or Abraham Kuyper, or contemporary thinkers like Alvin Plantinga or Nicholas Walterstorff. This is not the kind of faith she's talking about. She kind of has the faith of I'm going to believe it in spite of the evidence. And so that's the view of faith that she's affirming. I don't think it's a view of faith that most sophisticated religious believers actually hold, but it's one that she thinks that they hold. In fact, she says this in her article, that the epistemology of faith is able to ignore contradictions, contrary evidence, and logical implications. Indeed, one test of faith is its capacity to resist the blandishments of rationality. The stronger the rational arguments against a belief, the more faith is needed to adhere to it. I have a friend who's a philosopher who gave a lecture several years ago at in upstate New York at I forget what university, and it was on the arguments for God's existence. And in the audience was somebody that wasn't a student at the university, was just a person who had heard about the lecture from at her local church, and she was upset about the lecture because she said, if these arguments are good for God's existence, that means I won't have faith. In other words, she assumed that having good reasons for one's beliefs, in fact, she accepted, even though she herself was a religious believer, she actually accepted the understanding of faith and reason that someone like Sherry, who's hostile to religious belief, in fact accepts. One other quote from Sherry, which I have in the notes. She says, "Well, it may for the faithful." It's the last quote here in your notes. "For the reasonable, that is, those who follow reason, both the source and evidence for the truth lie in common human observation, experience, and reasoning." Okay, let me move on then to our last thinker, and then I'm going to raise some questions, and I want to give obviously Professor Gordon enough time to be able to respond and then to open up the floor for questions. One more quote from Sherry. She says, "Indeed, the one test of faith is the capacity, the stronger the rational arguments against a belief," I want to complete this quote, "the more faith is needed to adhere to it. However, this is the important part, however, secular science and liberal politics, both committed to the primacy of reason, necessarily deny that any truth is incontestable." So let me move on then to a more sophisticated defense of this point of view. Professor Brian Leiter at the University of Chicago published a book earlier this year called "Why Tolerate Religion?" And in that book, which consists largely of several articles that had been published elsewhere in law reviews, offers this analysis of religious beliefs that I think it's in line with what Gay and Sherry offer, but is a much more sophisticated and nuanced defense. And this is on your notes as well. He says, "At least some beliefs central to religion issuing categorical commands on action, demands that must be satisfied no matter what an individual's antecedent desires and no matter what incentives or disincentives the world offers up." What he means here is that religious believers are going to be faithful, really serious ones, despite persecution, despite the fact that people will in fact offer up disincentives. That's what he means here. And so in a way, one of the points that he makes in his book, there are actually good consequences for this, right? That there are some cases where people who have stood up against social injustices have done so based on their belief in God, even though they've suffered personal loss. And so it's not entirely a negative assessment. The second part of his standard or criteria is this: at least some beliefs central to the religion do not answer ultimately, or at least at the limit, to evidence and reasons, because evidence and reasons are understood in other domains concerned with knowledge of the world. Religious beliefs, in virtue of being based on faith, are insulated from ordinary standards of evidence and rational justification, the ones we employ in common sense and science. So the core to, I think, if you had to summarize this particular understanding of religion, I call it secular rationalism, and I think it's based on three beliefs or assumptions about religion, and these are in your the second page of your notes. The common thread: religious beliefs are irrational because they are based, one, on unprovable claims, in the sense that they are the sorts of beliefs that cannot in principle be proven, incontestable claims in the sense that they are the sorts of beliefs that cannot in principle be falsified, and 3, claims that cannot change or develop because they are insulated from the ordinary standards of evidence and rational justification. I want to briefly go over those and then just draw a conclusion about how these thinkers treat religious beliefs and kind of clarify what I'm saying and what I don't think I'm saying. First, I think there's several problems. One major problem with this view is that it embraces something called, it naively embraces something called narrow foundationalism. Now, this is not a lecture on philosophy, but I'll be really brief here on what I mean by that. Narrow foundationalism is an understanding of how we acquire knowledge, and it has its roots in the philosopher Descartes. And essentially, and this is a real brief and probably highly superficial presentation of it, but it's the view that there are certain properly basic beliefs that we have, and then all our other beliefs are derived from them. So, for example, we have beliefs about the world that we derive from the hard sciences. We have empirical beliefs. We have logical beliefs that seem to be that don't require us to look at the empirical world. Now, over the past 30 or 40 years, and even actually probably the last 50 years, a number of philosophers have challenged this understanding of knowledge. And I'm just going to briefly explain how one can challenge this. Remember the quote from Sherry, where she says that liberal politics and modern science are based on the assumption that there are no incontestable truths. Now, the problem with that is, first off, the claim that reason necessarily denies incontestable truths is either itself an incontestable truth or not. Now think about it. If it's an incontestable truth, that means what? That there is at least, that it's not the case that there are no incontestable truths. But if it isn't an incontestable truth, then we have a reason to reject it. It's what is called self-refutation. It's like claiming, if I were to walk up here and say, don't believe anything I say. I mean, well, wait a second, should I believe that? If you do, and of course you've refuted it. Right? It's like claiming I have a brother who's an only child. It's self-refuting. The other problem with it is that there seem to be, in fact, incontestable truths, or truths that seem nearly so. So what are some incontestable truths? Well, all bachelors are unmarried males. 2 + 2 = 4. Circumference of a circle circumference equals 2 pi radius. These seem to be true in every possible world. On the other hand, there seem to be moral beliefs that we hold that are actually seem to be pretty near to be incontestable. Not that someone couldn't contest it, but if somebody were to contest it, we think that they were odd. So, for example, it is morally wrong everywhere and always to torture children for fun. The proper end of the human mind is the acquisition of wisdom. Human persons are beings of immeasurable worth and dignity. I mean, these seem to be beliefs that if someone were to say that they hold them, we wouldn't, and they couldn't, let's say, offer you proof for them, we wouldn't say they were irrational. So, supposing my grandmother, who died 11 years ago, says, I believe it's wrong to torture children for fun, and I said, Grandma, prove it. And she goes, I don't know how to, I just always have believed it. Would she be irrational because she couldn't give you a knockdown, drag-out moral argument? Of course not. Right? So it seems that there are lots of things that we believe that seem perfectly rational to believe in, for which we don't have great arguments. When I teach political philosophy at Baylor, and we go over issues of fundamental rights, and I ask my students, prove to me, or why do you think liberal democracy, or why should we believe that human beings or citizens should be treated with equal dignity and respect before the law? They have a really difficult time giving an answer. That doesn't mean it's an irrational belief to hold. Okay? So the point here is that if this is the standard by which we're going to evaluate the rationality of beliefs, not only do religious beliefs go out the window, most of what we believe goes out the window. I mean, even my belief that I had breakfast this morning, I don't believe that based on empirical evidence. I don't go back to the hotel and go, look, the sink has, crumbs in it. That's proof that now I'm rational in believing I had breakfast. No, it's based on a memory, right? But the memory could be wrong. So it seems as though there's lots of things that we believe that don't require this kind of evidence. Let me just say a few more things and then turn it over to Professor Gordon. And here I have to be very, very brief. I think these thinkers in each one of the cases, and to a lesser extent with Leiter, because he does cite the literature but doesn't really engage it in his book, and that is that over the past 50, 60 years or so, there's been quite a voluminous amount of literature that's been published in philosophy, especially in the philosophy of religion, specifically dealing with these issues of faith and reason. By thinkers some of you may be familiar with, like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Walterstorff, my own colleague Alex Pruss, and my colleagues Alex Pruss and Steve Evans. They've published in some of the most important and prestigious venues in the world, books, articles, peer-reviewed publications, making a case for the rationality of religious belief that have been criticized, to be sure, but they've been largely well received. And so one of the things that I've noticed as a philosopher who came to the law late in my career is how little some of the legal scholars who take this aggressive, critical approach to religion, how little they know about what's going on in disciplines that actually deal with questions of religious belief and rationality. And in any event, so I think they beg, the secular rationalism begs substantive questions. One of the objections is what about the question of whether whether a belief ought to be incontestable? We've already dealt with that briefly when I brought up Sherry's comment. But it turns out that there are secular positions that seem equally insulated from contrary evidence. So for example, in my discipline, philosophy, there's a school of thought concerning the nature of the human mind or the brain called eliminative materialism. And it holds that there are literally no beliefs. You don't have any beliefs. That your beliefs, that in fact all you are is a purely material substance. Because beliefs would in fact, if they exist, be immaterial. So there's a strong commitment on the part of those that defend this point of view to a view of materialism, that all that exists is the material world, and that our common sense intuitions are mistaken here. Now, one could say, is that an irrational belief? Well, or it wouldn't even be a belief, right? But is it an irrational point of view? Well, it depends. I mean, in one sense, I don't think it is an irrational point of view. Somebody who thinks that materialism works as a worldview, that it seems to answer a lot of questions, isn't so much bothered by anomalies all the time. He or she may be hopeful that they're going to be solved in the future. Well, that is precisely the same position that religious believers have when they are confronted with anomalies, right? You don't give up the entire worldview based on one or two anomalies. Even in this case, I think there's good reasons to abandon materialism, but I can understand why someone can accept it, and I don't think they're rational in doing so. The point is that you find within even so-called secular worldviews a kind of resistance to contrary evidence, not because there's an ignorance or a willingness to be closed-minded, but it's that the view explains so much, why abandon it based on something that you are hopeful will be answered in the future. One other criticism, or to respond to the last criticism, one of the things that you notice in the history, at least of most religions, and in my own faith as a Catholic, one of the things that I've noticed is how, in Christianity in general, I suppose you can apply this to, is the way in which, at least with certain Christian traditions, have handled particular social and cultural changes, and have done so with a certain level of integrity. So, for example, in the early Christian church, the rival understandings that the church had to face were Stoicism and Platonism. And what did they do? They appropriated them. That is, they took those schools of thought and they said, look, there's a way in which we can understand these schools of thought while maintaining the integrity of our creeds. And so this is not that unusual. In my own, as a Catholic, it wasn't until 1965 that the Catholic Church issued a definitive statement on religious liberty. Right? And it did so partly because of a young, actually this time wasn't that young at the time, Jesuit priest named John Courtney Murray, who convinced the Vatican that their understanding of religious liberty was unduly shaped by the French Revolution, and that they didn't fully understand what the American view was. And so the church, reaching actually further back in its history, reclaimed understandings of religious liberty that it had largely forgotten. So it's not that unusual for religious traditions to appropriate and assimilate and to change over time while maintaining a kind of creedal integrity. So I think these thinkers actually don't fully understand how theology develops and doctrine develops and so forth. Let me just conclude by saying one thing that I'm not saying here is that religious believers can't hold irrational beliefs. Religious believers can hold irrational beliefs. What I am saying is that you can't, that there's no wholesale, one-size-fits-all understanding of religion that you can simply apply to all particular religious traditions and say they're all irrational. That you have to actually, you can't deal with this in the wholesale, you have to deal with it in the retail. That is, you have to go, let's say if a religious citizen offers an argument for a particular policy proposal and you think it's mistaken, it's not a critique to put the word religion as an adjective in front of the person's point of view. You actually have to get your hands dirty and deal with the argument. So I'm not suggesting that religious believers can't have irrational arguments. They most certainly can. What I am suggesting is that the kind of wholesale approach to the nature of religious belief is inadequate and that it should be abandoned. So thank you very much, and let me turn it over to Professor Gordon.
Thank you. That was just terrific. And I also owe, do you mind if I call you Frank?
Oh.
Terrific. I also owe Frank gratitude because we initially had scheduled this for tomorrow and I have jury duty. What can I tell you? So I thank you so much for your flexibility, and it's great to see you all here, seeing some people I've had in law school classes and as far back as undergrad too. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. And to hear this talk, especially from the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies, which is named after one of the founders of a group called Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They formed their organization because they were so outraged by an Establishment Clause case, the Everson case, which upheld payment of busing expenses for students to Catholic school, and so inhabiting that space, which is the legacy of what a group now known as Americans United for Separation of Church and State, proves how complicated things really are. And I must say, I have to agree with Frank that religious beliefs tend to be flattened on the pages of Supreme Court reports, and almost always in litigation. It just happens that people are forced to articulate things that to them are round but appear two-dimensional. on the page. And I also have to agree that intelligent design has become very interesting, and especially for Pennsylvania, in the Dover case, revealed how complicated questions are among organizations themselves dedicated to invigorating the study of something more complicated, or at least more rounded than Darwinism appears in most high school biology textbooks. So we in Pennsylvania have lived some of those questions. I have to say that I too have encountered repeatedly, even from my own mother, who basically treats religion as a matter, may she rest in peace, religion as a matter of taste. And said, I can't talk to you because you have acquired this revelatory aspect, and since I'm not allowed into that space because I don't believe it, we can't have a conversation. It was a sort of a de gustibus non disputandum est moment, and I kept saying, no, talk to me, really, I'm not so certain about everything. But it's difficult when we have divides like public and private, or secular and religious, that evaporate close up and that make conversations very difficult to hold in bright line categories. And honestly, the difficulty of navigating these things, these ephemeral concepts, what counts as secular and what counts as religious. As a lawyer, I will defend the religion of one. Most religion scholars focus on community as the definition of religion. So there are big fights going on. These are deep and ephemeral and difficult concepts. And some scholars have despaired so much of coming up with anything workable that they argue that the Constitution is itself deeply flawed and outdated by including religion in such a undefined and undefinable way, and that we should probably just abandon the attempt to divide the religious from the secular. But as Frank rightly says, legal theorists are rarely so reluctant, and they've spilled a lot of ink on the topic. Stephen Guy is very well known for his sort of rigid approach to church and state. He did die recently of ALS. I have to tell you, he was deeply beloved among his students who claimed religious commitments as well as others, so that his own personal aura was very different than his scholarship, and it's always made me smile when I think of him. I also, one of the most interesting questions is what do we count as evidence? When do we think about evidence? I remember reading a book by Simon Greenleaf, which was written in the 1850s, that said that the gospel's subjected to the latest rules of evidence and proven true, right? So I think there has been significant commitment to using very sort of legal sorts of evidence to prove the truth of at least some kinds of faith, and perhaps this is, this legacy explains some of the cantankerous approach of legal scholars, certainly in the early 20th century, if not recently, because for sure, we now know that it is very difficult to decide what counts as secular and what counts as religion, what counts as reason, what counts as rationality, what counts as faith. In fact, if anybody's been keeping up in reading the New Yorker, they're watching the collapse of the boundaries of science, because we can't recreate the results in experiments that even a decade or two ago seemed so incontestable. And I just welcome the scientists to my world, right? Watch it collapse around us. I do think that the sloppy reasoning that Frank talks about has been harmful. I think it is on a downward trajectory, honestly. I don't think it'll hold up much longer given how much the scientists are finding contestable. At this point, I think it's probably its hardest edges and most doctrinaire space, and I'm closing by circling back to Dover. Because, for example, you saw Judge Jones's opinion in the Dover case, which was as doctrinaire a definition of science as one could imagine. And you could literally see the philosophers of science sort of saying, no, please don't go there. You're leaving us incredibly vulnerable. And I think I'd just like to close by saying that not only do I agree about the contestability of the incontestable, but also I think others are finding themselves caught. Others who may once have been very confident are finding themselves caught in similar quandaries, and that going forward, we really need to work hard to create structures that are more capacious, more flexible, and more generous. And that's difficult when things wind up as two-dimensional on the pages of the Supreme Court. It's not easy, and I appreciate you leading us into those thickets. Thank you.
Yes, you know, you mentioned the Dover case, and you also mentioned the Dawson. I was originally hired at Baylor in the Dawson Institute, and actually it was my work on intelligent design that, when I first arrived there, that was a cause of controversy. And and I was sharing this with Lee when he picked me up at the airport last night, because he spent his first year at Baylor law school, and the issue I found to be fascinating. That's why when I went to WashU, that was my dissertation, because I did a graduate degree, a Master of Juridical Studies. The dissertation was on that topic because it dovetailed all these interests that I had: constitutional law, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science. My own view on it, however, is I actually think intelligent design is flawed as a view, and I've been critical of it because when I first published that work, people couldn't distinguish between making a legal argument for something being constitutionally permissible versus thinking the view is mistaken. And so that was one of the fights that I had to have when I was first at Baylor. I had to convince people that I actually had some actually theological objections to the view. But this is one of the cases when the culture war issues become so there's so much vitriol, is that sometimes people don't want to make those nuance distinctions. But I was actually asked to be an expert witness in Dover and declined for the reason. So for the reason that I don't think it was the defendants that wanted me, and I declined. I said I wouldn't be a good witness. I would make the con law case, but if you ask me questions about what I thought of it as a view, I probably am not going to give you the answers that you like. So
we have one back here.
Given the views expressed on permitting religious dialogue in legal arguments, what do you think of the Lemon v. Kirsten precedent, the decision, the Lemon test? Do you think that's a good precedent, or?
Oh. I wish I had the quote from Scalia about it being. It's interesting that case. In fact, the irony about that case is that I'll ask you it's a three-pronged test. Which is the prong that Pennsylvania and Rhode Island failed to meet?
In which particular?
It involved, I think, paying, supplementing teachers' salaries in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania schools. It was in excess of entanglement, which turns out to be the part of the test which rarely gets used now. I think the test has some flaws. In a way, what Berger's doing in that opinion, he just says, okay, I want to summarize all our prior cases in a way that's understandable. It winds up obviously getting picked up by later courts and becomes the Lemon test, right? I think the weakest part of the test is the purpose prong. And I think the reason for that is that purpose gets shifted from the purpose of the law to the motives of the legislators. And I think the court, that's a fundamental confusion I think the court makes here. I published an article on this in 2005 in the Hastings Constitutional Law Quarterly called The Court of Disbelief. And I'm very critical of it because I think what it does, you have legislators then put in a position is they can't really, with full integrity, tell the public why they're supporting this law. They have to come up with, they have to give secular motives. And I think it actually winds up being a kind of a way of sequestering certain beliefs from sight when in fact legislators, I don't think there's anything wrong with a legislator having religious motives. If the statute itself can be defended as a perfectly legitimate form of public policy with good secular reasons, why the legislator does it, I just think is not relevant. So the example I use in my articles, I say, imagine you've got two states, Connecticut and Virginia. Connecticut passes it follows, the Danbury Baptists send their letter to Jefferson. They convince the Connecticut legislature to pass a free exercise clause like the federal Constitution has. And they do it, it turns out, because it's motivated by Baptist citizens who believe in the separation of church and state. Ironically, the free exercise, it would be disestablishment clause. The disestablishment clause winds up being religiously motivated. Whereas in Virginia, you have the exact same, in my fictional scenario, the exact same constitutional amendment. It looks just like Connecticut's, and yet it's motivated by non-religious reasons. And it seems to me that, what's the difference? That's a long answer to a question. The question is, I think the Lemon test is flawed, and I think for that reason. And then you get different ways of interpreting it. Like you have O'Connor, kind of giving this kind of endorsement test, assessment of purpose, or whether it advances or inhibits religion. So.
Your argument seems to say that all science doesn't support separation of law and faith. The unified field theorem says that all things came from singularity, and singularity would be God. It's something that throws that on the head. Could you elaborate on that?
Wow, you're talking out of my ken right now. I will say a few things about the relation between science. I think one of the mistakes, I've been critical of this in a piece I published a couple of years ago called "How to Be an Anti-Intelligent Design Advocate," and I think one of the mistakes that some religious believers make is they think of the claims of religion as being in competition with the claims of science. So for example, you have my friend Michael Behe at Lehigh University making the argument that, look, the bacterial flagellum seems to exhibit a kind of specified complexity. Since we know specified complexity can only be the consequence of a mind, there must be a mind behind it. And then you have people like Richard Dawkins and others critical saying, well, wait a second, there's other ways to account for this without appealing to divine intervention. What you get then is that you have this sort of the secularist and the religious believer fighting over this sliver of turf in nature, thinking it's either going to be God or nature. But classical theism says that divine action is not in competition with nature. That's actually something that we get later in the Enlightenment. That's why Paley's argument for the watchmaker winds up saying, it's got to be a mind. If it's not a mind, it's just nature. Classical theism says that nature itself is ultimately contingent upon God, and that it's not in competition. So I didn't answer your question because it's outside of my area of specialty, but I think that the attempt to look at divine action as in competition with nature, I think, is a mistake that both aggressive secularists and some religious believers make. And I think it's actually not consistent with the classical understanding. So what you find is that you find people then looking for gaps in nature. This is where God acted. And that ultimately says what? The rest of nature is not itself the result of divine action, which is not what traditional theists actually believe. So,
time for one more question. I noticed sort of a tension between the two comments, in that Professor Gordon seems to be saying is that maybe science isn't quite as rational as everyone thinks, and you seem to be saying, Professor Beckwith, that religion is more rational than you think. And I was wondering, it seemed to me that you were fighting this battle on that turf of rationality, whereas Professor Gordon was more willing to maybe step away from that. I was wondering if you wanted to comment on what you had to say about it.
sure.
Say about that.
I think, science, I guess, like the word religion. I mean, when you say religion, it's, so that a couple of years ago, one of my students said, who do you think wins between science and religion? I said, well, tell me the science and tell me the religion, tell me the argument. So I don't think you can actually talk about this in the wholesale, in the sense that you can sort of come up with one grand theory. However, and I don't want to speak for Professor Gordon, but I think that you can have arguments within the hard sciences and the soft sciences that are better than other arguments. And I think, and I don't know if this is what she's saying, I think that what goes into, let's say, putting forth a scientific theory oftentimes involves a lot of non-scientific factors. So what happens is, why do we choose this particular set of problems to solve rather than another? Well, but I don't think that's irrational. I think that's just now, some people would say it's irrational because they use the hard sciences as the sort of paradigm of knowledge. But I think that's a mistake. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we believe that are perfectly rational. Again, I don't want to speak for Professor Gordon, but I don't think we're inconsistent. I think it's just different emphasis.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that what's interesting is watching the development of these enormous fields of inquiry and knowledge and their repeated collapse. And so the idea that there's a difference between secularism and religion, or science and reason, over time you can see it acquiring harder edges and then being corroded, almost like a paradigm shift. But I'm not sure that that's incontestable either.
Well, think about like something that was dominant, and you probably know more about this than I do. That in the early 20th century, the eugenics movement, which was sort of that everyone who was really smart believed in it, and of course it was us anyway. If you don't believe in this, you're unscientific. And of course, now we look back and we see the statutes that were passed, like in Virginia, the statute that allowed for forced sterilization. We think, oh, horrible. But at the time, it was like anybody who was like really smart believed it. So you just have to. I don't know if that's what. So in that case, what was doing a lot of the work wasn't so much the science, but the prior philosophical beliefs of what counts as appropriate ways to treat other human beings.
Thank our guests from the conference. I want to thank the members of the community from local churches and elsewhere who came in today. We really appreciate you coming. All of our events are open to the public, so we welcome you at future events as well. And thank you to the law students who chose us from the extremely conflicted schedule today. Do let your colleagues know that our food, though, tastes better when you eat it in our room listening to our speakers. It just gives it an extra flavor. And if you would, there's a sign-in sheet out on the soda table. If you haven't signed in, we'd like to know who came to our events. Finally, tonight we have a recruitment event. If you're interested in being involved with putting these events together, and the Federalist Society at University of Pennsylvania is at 5 p.m. in Silverman 280. And we'll have some kind of food there. Probably be pizza, but as always, we'll have food. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, food is.
What would it like to meet you again? I guess.